basically the definitive visual history of the rock and roll era. So our goal from the very beginning was to, I grew up listening to Casey Kasem, the American Top 40 every week, watched MTV in the 80s in its heyday. And it seemed like music, the culture of music and such was not as accessible as it is now. I mean, you can jump on YouTube or Spotify and hear anything you want. And I came from a generation where you heard a song on the radio, you couldn't immediately Shazam it. You'd have to, either call and request it and record it on your Maxell cassette tapes. I don't know if you ever did that. Or you go out to the store and buy it and you get that album and it was like a ritual, buying that record, kind of putting your hard-earned allowance down. I was a little kid in the 80s, buying the vinyl, buying the cassette, listening to every single song, watching the video on MTV. And it was more of it wasn't as, what's the word I'm looking for? It wasn't immediately available. You really had to work for it, and really search out that knowledge. And so I tried to get my hands on any book I could, because this is before the internet, about music, about the stories behind the songs. My dad shared a lot of stories behind the songs because he knew about it from growing up. And he raised me on Motown and Elvis and the Beatles and the Stones and all that great music. And then, of course, I discovered Prince and Michael Jackson and Springsteen and Cyndi Lauper and Tina Turner and all that great music from the 80s. And then that turned into metal and turned into new wave and all that kind of thing. And so just my passion and love for music, I wanted to go back to that heyday, that feeling, that passion of having that music, and hearing it for the first time. And so it's really a love letter to the rock and roll era. We interview, we've done almost 600 interviews, somewhere in there, with the songwriters and the singers of the rock era, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even newer artists as well. But stories behind the songs, what inspired a great song and why it still resonates and with the culture and everything like that. And so I feel like that's important. It's an important work to do. It's evergreen content that will always be here. And that's it. Yeah, that's the passion, we want to get the story behind every song that was, that moved the needle from the artist. Yeah. Guess so. I'm not really comfortable with even the term professor of rock. It was a nickname that was given to me by the Beach Boys after I interviewed them early on, and I didn't grab that. The producer, the general manager of the TV show that from a local station, was like, "That's what we're going to call you, Professor of Rock." So I think historian. I think that. I'm just a fan, a stand-in for the fan is what I consider myself. I think like if somebody's tour bus broke down, they didn't have cell service and they knocked on your door and you had Ozzy or Alice Cooper in your front room for an hour or two while they're waiting for somebody to come and tow them, what would you ask them? If you're a mega fan of whether it's Toto or the Pet Shop Boys or whoever, what would you ask them? And so that's where I'm coming from, more of a stand-in for the fan and try to get those stories that we've never heard. I always say that they say sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I don't really care about the sex and the drugs. It's about the rock and roll for me. I think that a great song is what it all comes down to. And I feel like if you look at the 60s, 70s, and 80s are a great example, where, something like Toto Africa is one that just comes to mind, right? It's a song that was #1 in 1983, and then it's had a renaissance. The same thing happened with Don't Stop Believin' Journey. And I think there's a lot of songs that have had this renaissance, and that's why the Beatles are the biggest band ever, because they wrote great songs. They wrote incredible music, life-changing music. The Doors, the Stones, you go on and on and on. If you throw out the group, the Animals, everybody knows House of the Rising Sun, We Got to Get Out of This Place. So to me, when people write great songs, and it used to be great albums. I think the album, unfortunately, to some degree, is dead, and I wish that weren't so, because the album, to me, is a collection of songs of what the artist was going through at that moment. I mean, whether it's Pink Floyd or the Smiths or Led Zeppelin, but I think that when somebody writes a great song, that will be the through line and will last for ages. And so I think that that's one thing that you're seeing. In my opinion, I don't think they're writing as many great songs as they were back in the day. I think that that's a little bit due to just says Adam Reeder, right? I'm just my opinion. But I think that has to do with emailing stuff to one another instead of being in a room. I think there's a magic, at least in these interviews where I've spoken to artists, there's a magic that was in that room where you'd have some of the great producers of all time, the great songwriters, the great artists, where they're fighting with each other. I want this lyric. No, you can't have this lyric in or it won't get played on the radio. Well, this is my artistic vision and it has to stay this way. And you have this battle going on, and then ideas come from this experimentation and everything like that. Like back in the day when they only had 4 tracks or 8 tracks to record things on, you couldn't just pull up any sample that you wanted. I think that takes away creativity a little bit. I think if there's, when I interviewed a lot of people from Motown, I mean, they were using things on records that, remember a story that was told where Bob Dylan came down to Hitsville, USA, where the great Motown studio, and he asked the great songwriting team of Holland Dozier Holland, who wrote all the Four Tops and the Supremes music and Martha and the Vandellas. He asked them, where's all the magic happen? Where's this, all these great sounds that you're getting? And Lamont Dozier looked at him and said, this is it. Well, Hitsville, USA was like a room. It was like a little teeny house, It wasn't this phenomenal recording studio. And so Bob Dylan's like, yeah, I get it. You don't want to share the secrets. And Lamont Dozier's like, that's it. That's what we're doing. I mean, that's so innovative. They would take a broken tambourine because they didn't have the money to go buy a brand new stuff, and they would make that work, or they would use like snow chains from people's tires and create a certain sound. And to me, I think that creativity, I hope that can find its way into newer music, because some of it can seem a little bit robotic and a little bit contrived that way. But I don't know. That's kind of a long answer to what you asked, but I think it all comes down to great songs, and there's still great songs. We may not hear them on the radio, but there's some bands that I think that you guys have on your label that are great bands. I really thought their music was amazing. It needs to be played on the radio. People need to hear this music, and that's there's just got to be a way for us to get these songs out there for people to hear, because and I guess it's been the same always. Payola, there was Payola back in the day where a song would be number one where maybe it really wasn't number one. But I think a great song will stand the test of time. So. Marketing and competition are killers. I think that, I hate to say anything negative or bad about anything, because music is so subjective. I mean, anybody who says that they absolutely love Justin Bieber, I can't deny that. I can't say, oh yeah, not so much, because that's their truth. That's what they believe and what they love. And so I'm never gonna, hardly ever you're gonna hear me say something negative. I try not to. It just doesn't float my boat. It doesn't hit my gut, and that's okay. If it hits somebody else a certain way, then I respect that. I think I was interviewing Matty Healy from the 1975, and he said that, and I thought that was great. He said, look, if you like Justin Bieber, like Justin Bieber, and I thought that, he said, we like what we like, and we do, we do. So having said that, though, I will say that I think that competition shows have made it a cattle call, and that's not right. To me, American Idol and The Voice and things like that, it kind of kills. I think Dave Grohl had a quote that went around the internet for a while. It was a meme that said, what's killing creativity, or his idea was that, you know, you need to get into a room with four other guys and suck, play your instruments, and you're all going to suck, and then all this in your garage, and then all of a sudden you become Nirvana. And I love that quote. I'm probably, you know, totally killing it. It's probably not exactly what he said, but the idea was that who who is you know, Simon Cowell or Katy Perry even to say that somebody's great or not? You know, to me, Bob Dylan, Neil Young, they never would have done well on a show like that. And they're some of the greatest writers and musicians that have ever lived. So to me, uh, there's a mantra that I live by, and you got to let your light shine for the world with your music, whether or darkness. You know, light and
Yep.
darkness. There's both, but you know, usually I like music that lifts me up and helps me to overcome. And there's always time for that music where you're soul searching. But there's a lyric from a song that I really love, that I live by, and it's such a great lyric that actually Bono reused it in a U2 song. He said this, the guy on the radio said this, but it's from a guy that Bruce Coburn, who's a singer songwriter out of Canada in the 80s, a song called Lovers in a Dangerous Time. But the lyric is, nothing worth having comes without some kind of fight. You got to kick at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. And I love that lyric. You got to kick at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. You got to keep going. You can't give up. You got to. So if you're a musician and you're passionate and you're turning these experiences that you're having, whether good or bad, into music to lift your soul out of this and lift other souls, which is what great music does. You got to keep going. You got to keep kicking at that darkness until it bleeds daylight. So to me, that's what I think is killing it. I think that back in the day, labels would allow people the time and the what am I looking for? The time to grow and to become who they were. I mean, can you imagine if you don't have a hit the first time out, if you don't have a social media following that's X, you're going to get passed over in a lot of cases. And I think that that's wrong. What would have happened to Bruce Springsteen? I mean, he had a couple albums that didn't sell, and same thing with Billy Joel. If he would have, if the label hadn't stuck with him and believed in him, you know, there's a lot of stories like that. If you go back where people had 3 or 4 albums to develop, and I think it's about development. You've got to be able to give these artists, you know, a little bit of security, to be honest with you. You know, John Lennon said that. He said, you want to make an artist better, you know, give them a little bit of leeway, give them a little bit of a road, you know, to be able to develop and walk down the road and create great music. I think we're so impatient today that we want everything right now. And if we don't have a hit the first time out, and how many Neil Youngs, how many Bob Dylan's, how many John Lennons are we losing out on because we're not allowing that creativity to develop? And so that's why it's great labels like Edge Out Records, where you're giving people a chance to go out and develop, because that's where the great music came from people who have a chance to go. When you think about it, when American Idol, if you go out there and you sing and you have a great voice, all of a sudden you punch your ticket to Hollywood or whatever, and you're immediately on a stage. It's important to pay your dues. You know, I think a lot of these bands go out and they play every bar, you know, and they're living in a van down by the river. Now they're living in a van, right? And they're just going from town to town. Some of these guys I've interviewed, they didn't know if they'd have enough money to make it to the next town. We either eat or we buy gas to get to the next gig. You know, that kind of stuff brings such experience that is so rich that comes out in the music. And you know, you can't just have it the next day. I think that this, you know, kind of automatic pop star, you know, that they create where it's in a package and ready to go, doesn't it's not real, you know. And I don't know, that's my take on it. I think that you've got to allow these incredible musicians the time and the development time to grow and to show what they can do, you know. People like Jerry Wexler and Ahmet Ertegun, legends who ran labels, and Seymour Stein, Sire Records. These were real record men who loved music. They were so passionate about music. I mean, some of these guys were even like musicians themselves. They were songwriters and producers, and they really, really cared about the music. And to me, I think that they just Clive Davis, these were real record men. I'm not saying anything about people today, but I think it's become more of a business, and you know, separating business from pleasure. I mean, if you just treat it only like a business, then sincerity and passion and some of those things get lost in the shuffle. So to me, I think that uh, thinking back on some of these, the musicians that I've interviewed, there was no plan B. That's incredible to me. A lot of these musicians who said it wasn't well, I'm going to go to school at the same time that I do this. Great musicians that I talked to, it was music or bust. They had no plan B. They were like, I was either going to make it or I wasn't going to make it. Like, it wasn't, well, I'll go get my certification and at the same time. And that's the smart thing to do, right? That's what people told me growing up, right? You got to go get a real job and that kind of thing. And I hate that. I think that completely destroys creativity and destroys that, positivity. If I would have had people around me saying, hey, you got a gift, go after it. I remember the first interview I ever did was Kenny Loggins, and he pulled me aside after the interview was over and really praised me. He praised me during the interview. He said, this is a great interview, man. How have I never heard of you? You're going to be around forever, all kinds of. He pulled me aside and he said, look, you have a gift, and it's your responsibility to go after that gift with everything you have, and let me open some doors for you. But you got to be doing this, man. You got to be capturing this before these artists pass away. This is great stuff. That kind of positivity, that lit a fire under me, right? And I think the same thing happens with these musicians, with bands, with artists. They need to be able to, like I said, have that space to create. And especially in COVID times, you think about it, people aren't able to tour right now. How are these musicians going to make money? Spotify only pays X amount, or streaming. I don't want to just say Spotify. It's all streaming. They're not paying the musicians enough to live. They don't have a living wage. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem. It's a problem that needs to be solved really fast if we want our culture to remain relevant artistically anyway. I think that's probably one of the biggest crises out there right now. And I know people will say, oh, that's so dramatic. It's not dramatic. Music is such a lifeblood. It's such a way for us to survive. Like I said, the way that we unify. If you take that away 20 years from now, what are you going to have? Because it's always fun to have a nice little poppy song that everybody likes for about a week or two and then never wants to hear it again. There's something to be said for a song that will stand the test of time, that is the reason why you get out of bed every morning, the reason why you pronounce your love for your significant other that you're going out. You know what I mean? These are things that matter. These albums, these songs matter. And so we've got to find a way to get these musicians so that they don't have to live hand to mouth, and a lot of people out there don't realize this. A lot of people like the regular person thinks, oh, that guy signed a record label, he's a millionaire, and it's not true. It's not true. People are really struggling out there. There are musicians who they don't know how they're going to make it. And these are people that have had, I read an article the other day that said this person that's written, like 11 top 10 hits for different new artists. We're talking like major artists. They're struggling to make ends meet. And so, we've got to figure out a way to compensate our musicians what their worth is, and their worth is off the charts. The difference between 30 years ago, 60s, 70s, 80s, and now, and there was still some of that back then, but for the most part, most people were in it because it's the reason that blood flows through their veins. They do music because it's the only way they can survive or express themselves, and they do it for the right reasons. They're up there. I don't mean to sound like an episode of The Bachelor or something. Doing it for the right reasons. Are they doing it for the right? And throw stones at me if I'm wrong, but I think for the most part, people are in it right now to be famous. And I think that shows like American Idol and The Voice do not help that. Now, they give great opportunities to people that want to. So I don't want to blame the show itself, but I do want to say that we've got to find that balance between, money and it's kind of like art and commerce. You got to find that balance between art and commerce. And right now, I think it's all commerce, maybe 98% commerce and 2% art. And that's why in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and part of the 90s, I think it was a very good balance. You have a band like REM, who was a great band, and they knew that they had to play a little bit to their audience. They had to grow their audience. So you'd hear a poppy song like Stand, or whatever. But then you'd hear a great album of all great songs. And that's back Warner Brothers were really pushing them, and they would allow them the opportunity to succeed. And I'm not saying anything bad about labels. Labels are great, because if we didn't have Universal, if we didn't have Warner Brothers, and we didn't have Sony, where would we be? These are the labels that pump the money into developing and such. But I just think that we can spend more time on development, more time on real artistry, and allow them, again, that balance. Find the pop stars that will bring in the big money, but at the same time, use some of that money to bring the artistry to a certain level. And so people like yourself can survive, make a living wage. And really, this is probably the most important part of it. Be able to do music full time. You know what I mean? If you can do music full time and you can focus and create and not have to worry how you're going to pay the rent, and not have to take another job. That was the difference. Springsteen and Billy Joel and all these guys, they could go out on the road, and for the most part, they could survive. They had people that could make sure that they were going to have a living wage so that they could create and they could do it full time. It's very hard. And I've just gotten to this point where I've been doing Professor Rock. I've been very fortunate to be able to do this full time for, 5 or 6 years, because we've had investors and people who have believed in this and who have really stepped forward to help us. But if I had to do this part-time, I wouldn't be able to give all my focus to it. I certainly wouldn't be able to do daily content and be able to honor these musicians and honor their work. So let's see. I think that real instruments by real musicians. I think that again, so many people are using samples, like a certain sample, and it's I guess what I call it brain dead auto-tune pop music that is very much following rules. You have to be at the chorus within 3.5 seconds of the song starting. You have to have this, you have to have that. I don't like the rules. There's these rules in pop music, and to me, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, they didn't have rules. It was about what was best for the song. Don't Stop Believing is a great example. You don't even hear the chorus until the last 30 seconds of the song, 40 seconds of the song. It allows the song the room to breathe. And I think that's a big thing that I've learned as I've been doing this, is that you listen to, like, okay, a pop act from the 80s, Janet Jackson. If you go back and you listen to the song, which was a #1 hit, When I Think of You, which is a poppy song. I love the song. It's one of my favorite pop songs ever. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who I've interviewed, great producers and writers who helped Janet to craft those first classic albums. When I Think of You, it starts, and you don't hear her come in until about 35, 40 seconds into the song. You hear all these separate instruments separated. It starts out with synthesizers, then you hear the bass, and then you hear the drum beat, and then you hear a little guitar, and it just has all this pop candy in your head all at a separate time. It's really, really cool. And nowadays, there's no way they would allow 40 seconds for the vocal to come in. It's got to be right off the bat. It's got to be. And so I just think there's rules. And we need to break these rules. We need to get back. Oh, we need back out of this conventional thinking that we have.
Cool.
I really liked Bohemian Rhapsody. I thought that was great. I thought the actor did a phenomenal job portraying Freddie Mercury. Um, I, uh, I think as long as I like the Brian Wilson biopic that they did several years ago, I thought there was great acting there. I'm more fascinated with how they came up with the song, so that's why I love like the Brian Wilson one and Bohemian Rhapsody, because it was so cool how they showed them recording Bohemian Rhapsody and how they came up with "We Will Rock You," you know, with the stomping, and how they came up with "Another One Bites the Dust." And I loved how that was weaved into the storyline, because that is the story. The music that you hear, if you want to hear an artist's story, you just listen to their music, and their music more than anything tells you what's going on. Excuse me. Um, I think that sometimes when it goes off away from the music too much, I don't really care for it as much. It's a little bit too fluffy or musical without kind of the deepness of the stories behind that. It loses me a little bit, but I think it's great. I hope that they make many more. I'd love to see a rock biopic on some of my favorite artists. I'd love to see the Smiths. I'd love to see the Cure. I'd love to see, some of these bands that really had cult status and really changed the way that people listen to music. I think there hasn't been a phenomenal Beatles biopic yet. I'd love to see a really good Beatles biopic, so on and so forth. So I think it's great for the industry and it's great for the fans. I would say, excuse me, I would say Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, just because he's such a hero, and I think he's one of the last musical geniuses who is walking the earth right now. And so that was such an amazing interview. I love Carlos Santana. He was great because he's just such a spiritual uh, individual and just so full of light and love, and that was a great interview. And I I pretty much get a kick out of any interview that I do, because it's just great to be able to speak to the person who wrote or created the song. And but I'd say that interviewing Jimmy Jam, and who produced and wrote so many of Janet and so many other people's hits. I like to interview the songwriters and producers like Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, who the couple that wrote "You've Lost That Love and Feeling." They're wonderful, just very humble and down to earth. Sammy Hagar was a great interview as well, just a nice guy. So there's been quite a few. Ann Wilson of Heart was amazing too, and it's just great to see who all of these artists are as people, as regular people.